thank you for coming. And there's many people here that I know I respect greatly, and I appreciate your interest. So obviously you're all therapists, so I wasn't sure how to pitch this, whether, you know, there would be people who knew nothing about working with ex-members. So I'm just going to pitch it as I have done and just see what you make of it. And then there should be a good deal of time after as well to ask questions. We can either ask the questions as we go along, or we can ask them afterwards. Okay, if anything's unclear, just say. Lorna will see your hand go up. Okay. So, okay, let's say a potential client calls or emails, however they get in touch with you, and they say that they've left a Cultic group, that maybe they joined the group as an adult, maybe they were in a one-on-one coercive relationship, or maybe they were born in a Cultic group. So maybe, you know, they've come from various different sorts of backgrounds. And so you agree to meet them. Maybe you meet them face to face. Maybe you meet them via telehealth or video conferencing, and you go through the usual steps that you go through with the client. You may or may not have heard about the Cultic group, so it may be a name you're familiar with, it may not be. So what do you do next? Do you launch into regular therapy with this client, drawing on your generic training? Because if we're therapists, we've all probably worked very, very hard to get ourselves to a place where we're trained. So, and if you do, I wonder how that's going to go. Like, is that going to go well, or is that going to work out a little more problematic? Who knows? So, and then as you get to know them, you might find you don't really know much about the culture of that group. It may be a group you've heard of, but never worked with that person, sort of never worked with anyone from that group. So then, you know, there can be quite a lot of anxiety about that, sort of, ooh, you know, what's happening here? What, you know, how am I going to approach this? You might find that this client, that their nervous system is on hyper alert, and this may be shown by nerves, defensiveness, lack of trust, or they may be hypoaroused and dissociated, and this may show by low energy, they're not really fully engaged with the therapy, or they may be ambivalent about attending. So you might find that you also feel overwhelmed, de-skilled, unsure where to go next with this client. You thought you could help, you usually can, but maybe you find that you're unsure and start questioning yourself. Should you refer them on? But who will you refer them to? You already tried this with another client and had trouble finding a specialist in cult, working with cult survivors who had any space, because it seems like everyone who does this work's fully booked doing it. So what to do? What's going on? Will supervision help? Well, maybe if the supervisor's knowledgeable. So if you recognize this scenario, I hope to give you a basic way of thinking and a structure you might be able to adopt when it comes to working with former members and survivors. So I'm going to start with identity, and I'm going to go on to a PowerPoint presentation, because personally I find that easier, and it helps me not burble too much. So, you know, the issue of identity is obviously it's massive, and there are numerous theories of identity, and I'm fully aware of that. So I approach identity from a Gestalt psychotherapy perspective, and that's for no reason other than that I studied it for 4 years at master's level. So it's the one I'm most familiar with, and it's helped me build clear ideas around the pseudo-identity. And so I think with this client group, it's vital that we're aware of the identity formed as a member. You could call it their member identity. You could call it their pseudo-identity. I tended to use the term pseudo-identity. And so let's have a look at the PowerPoint, and I'll take you through that. And so what I've done is I've done the PowerPoint so that there's space down the right-hand side, so that you can put the little faces, whatever you call them, into the right-hand side of it, so that you can see what's actually on the PowerPoint. I hope that makes sense. So this isn't exactly the beginning because we've already started, but this is what the talk is called: the cult pseudo-identity and the phases of recovery and growth. Okay. So the first thing I just want to say briefly is that because obviously I'm going to talk about the kind of cult identity, but what we're hoping to build is an authentic identity. Again, there must be hundreds of books written about this sort of subject, but I want to just define the healthy, authentic identity and just say that I think it's evident when the individual is creatively adjusting in the service of their own psychological health and identity, and is not twisted against themselves in the service of others or a cultic or spiritually abusive group, which I think is the pseudo-identity. That's where we sort of sacrificing ourselves, giving ourselves to something that then becomes harmful to us. So that picture, by the way, is a really lovely beauty spot very close by to me. So I thought I'd give you a bit of prettiness in between all the rest. So I suggest that the pseudo-identity overlays the authentic identity within a cultic setting, constraining, squeezing, and restricting it. So one or two clients actually said to me, and this I published in an article years ago in 2008, which I've never had time to update, but one of them said, the cult identity overlayers me. I need to break out. So this was like a clue to me, a sense. And I was in a cult back in the 70s, so I know that I felt very constrained and stifled. And this person obviously had a very similar experience. But this idea of overlaying, and this other one said, the cult identity is superficial. What I mean is that it does go deep because it has been there a long time. For this person, it was 23 years. So this is first generation. And it has affected my core, my deep personality, but it is not me. It overlays me. I was forced to be who they wanted me to be. And I think that's a crucial statement. I was forced to be who they wanted me to be. So if we look at Margaret Singer and what she says, and I'm hoping everyone knows about Margaret Singer, her book's really worth getting and reading, even now, even though it's, 2003, I think. But it's a very helpful book. And she says that the group approved behavior is reinforced and reinterpreted as demonstrating the emergence of a new person. Members are expected to display this new social identity. So whatever, probably in most settings, not just Bible-based or whatever, the person is expected to change and become a new person, and they're expected to display this part of them. And Janja Lalich, in her great book, Bounded Choice, she said that this process of transformation involves a reorganization of the person's inner identity or sense of self. Typically, it occurs through a mixture of emotional appeals, rituals, instruction, self-examination, confession, and rejection, all in a context that deftly combines stress and harmony. Most often, guilt, shame, and anxiety are integral to this process. I think probably the idea of harmony is actually what I call confluence or merging. That the harmony is, if there's harmony, it's there because people aren't saying what they really think. They're what I call confluent or merged. So Lalich also says that responding to the demands can be exhausting and stressful, for it requires repeated acts of self-renunciation. That really rings true to me. At the same time, the person experiences relief at having found the answer, which is associated with a kind of personal freedom. And again, I think, you know, the radicalized kind of mindset of just sort of thinking you know all the answers, you've got the truth and no one else has, actually becomes very toxic for us later. So I've kind of used this analogy a few times because someone else said to me that it felt like they were buried under tarmac. I haven't put the quote in, but this idea like a seed. So I think of the authentic identity like a seed buried under tarmac, which is such a, you've got such an organic thing as a seed and such a, how can you put it, such an inorganic thing as tarmac. But seeds do break through tarmac, the shoots do break through actually, but it's a very harsh, hard sort of construction, isn't it? So I'm just going to say something, because as therapists, you know, you'll know about dissociation, and I don't think that the pseudo-identity is a dissociated part of us. I think the pseudo-identity is a part, but it's like an alien or foreign part. It's like the tarmac, it's not organically part of us. That's how I see it. But I do think that within our authentic identity, we can split further and there can be dissociated parts. So, you know, I think we have to determine and separate the dissociated authentic identity and the pseudo-identity. That sounds quite theoretical, but I think it's something one has to really keep one's eye open for. So how does this even happen? Like somebody's in a cult or in a very high demand, pressured situation where they have to change, their identity changes. You often hear people saying, and certainly my family said it, the first generation, their identity, you know, they really changed. Now, of course, the issue for second and multi-generation is more complex, way more complex, because that overlaying happens from birth and from very, very early stage. And so there isn't, I mean, every situation's different, but certainly a lot of the stories and situations I've heard about, there is very little opportunity for that little seed to really flourish or grow, and so it becomes overlaid from a very early age, and that's why so many struggle really to identify what is authentically mine and what isn't. But it is a job that we do as therapists. It's part of the work we do, helping them to identify what is authentically theirs, what of that seed is actually theirs, and what belongs to the tarmac. So I think that you know, the idea that this can happen, and this is where I reflected after I did my master's, thinking, well, how does that happen? And the Gestalt theory was very useful, and I think it happens through introjection. So I'm just giving you a very, very brief introduction here to these ideas. I've said more in other places and written a bit more about it. So an introject, from a Gestalt perspective, is something, a belief or behavior which you've taken into yourself that remains sitting in your psychological system like a lump of unchewed or undigested food in your gut. So the individual is unable to chew over what they were told. We don't have critical thinking. And that's been well written about, and I expect most people would identify with that who've been in that situation. So the individual's unable to chew over what they were told or what happened to them within the cult, and so it sits in them and causes discomfort. Like if you swallow a big lump of beef and you haven't chewed it over properly, it's really going to give you bellyache. But you can't digest it easily, so it doesn't nourish you, and you can't eliminate it, and it doesn't move out the other way, so it causes a lot of discomfort. So in the Dictionary of Psychology actually identifies introjects as generally the process by which aspects of the external world are absorbed into or incorporated within the self. The internal representation then taking over the psychological functions of the external objects. So this isn't Gestalt theory, but it fits very well. It's that we take it in, but then it has a life of its own. You know, we're told you're sinful or you're bourgeois, and you know you're not okay as you are, and we take that in, and then we take over the function of the object, and we start telling ourselves these things, and that's where we've introjected it, we've taken it into ourselves. So as a member, we introject the cult beliefs about ourselves, about the world, about others. It's not just about ourselves. It's about outsiders being, you know, bad and we're good, and all the complicated things that go on. So we're taking in that material from the environment without chewing it over. It's difficult to digest, so so gain nourishment from it, we don't. And introjects are so often negative. You know, you're sinful, you're mad. You know, therapy cults will just exacerbate mental health problems, make that person reliant on the therapist, instead of what a good therapist does is give, you know, expect people to leave and to end and to move on into another phase of their life. And introjects often show themselves in should. So I should. I always catch myself now when I should be what? I should be something, you know, and or I ought to, or I must. You know, it's the thing of catching it and questioning, actually, what should I be? Should I be perfect? Should I be whatever? And so when I catch it, but when I say it, I try and catch it and question myself. So just to summarize, I suggest that the pseudo-identity is not a dissociated part that needs integrating, if you remember that blue diagram, but an introjected part that needs chewing over and digesting, allowing what is nourishing to remain and eliminating the rest. So I hope that's clear. Does anyone have any questions? I mean, there's a lot in there, I realise.
Gillie, are you finished with the presentation part?
No.
Oh, okay. You're just asking for questions here.
Yeah, no, don't switch me off yet.
Okay.
I really like that analogy, Gillie. I think it's a very good paradigm as to what happens to people in the cult, because it helps to recognize that this is not part of your personality that's being used. It's a part of your, it's something you've taken in that's foreign, that isn't helping you to become a whole person, but instead is something that's foreign, that just lays there almost without any kind of change.
Exactly. Thank you.
Benji and Catherine each raised their hands. Okay. Benji?
Yeah, I don't know if we're gonna talk about it maybe later, but I didn't quite get the model with the cult identity, the authentic identity, and then the dissociate part. Could you go back on that? Like, I don't understand the dissociate part. Is it something? Yeah, I just don't get the model. So can we go back on that? Are you gonna talk about it later?
No, I'm not. No. So just if you imagine a seed and you think of the identity layering over, like, say, tarmac. I mean, it's kind of an idea. It's a picture or a metaphor in a sense. And then this is the authentic identity. So this is a kind of split part. It's not, fully integrated into the individual. It's not part of them. But that individual in their authentic identity can also split into parts. I don't know how much you know about, say, internal family systems therapy, or some of the trauma writing, such as Janina Fisher, Pat Ogden, people like that. They're talking about structural dissociation. So you could maybe have an investigation into some of those things. So what I'm talking about here is a structural dissociation within the authentic, within that person's identity. It's not a cult identity that they've taken in from outside. Is that any clearer for you, Benji?
Yes, thank you a lot.
Yes, good.
And Catherine?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Gillie, for the presentation. It's really interesting. I have a question about the cult pseudo identity. How it differs. If you are in an abusive relationship, you also might believe that you are bad or ugly or whatever that abuser is telling you. Do you have a way to explain the difference between that kind of programming and cult programming?
Well, I guess I would think it was pretty well the same process. Yeah. I'm using the term cult here because I'm speaking for ICSA, but I would normally talk much more like coercive, cultic, spiritual abuse. I think, extremes of spiritual abuse and that sort of thing. I think, this process is happening, and I think we're introjecting a lot of stuff that we're bad. So, and in the one-on-one, which you could argue, I don't know if you agree, but, like, it's a one-on-one cult. I mean, some of the people I've worked with, it just seems so similar. So I think the introject idea certainly fits. Whether the pseudo-identity was exactly the same,
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And just so, as a therapist, then it's just important to differentiate between the programming, as it were, what you were told, and the dissociated parts.
Yes, and the authentic and the parts that aren't dissociated. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, if it's extreme abuse, it's very likely there are mostly dissociated parts, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone?
So I'm going to carry on.
Go
There's
ahead.
lots more to come, by the way. This isn't the end. Sorry. So So with Introjects, this is a very practical thing that one can do, and I do it with all my clients, which is it's vital to highlight the Introjects and begin to chew them over using critical thinking in order to unlayer the pseudo-identity. So it's actually very practical, and I haven't put it in here, but you know, one way of doing that is getting someone to say, okay, what is your introject? So I was in a Bible-based cult, so it's easy for me to identify introjects for myself, which is I am bad, I am toxic, I am sinful. Those introjects were very, very strong. So then I could write that introject down in one column and say, okay, I am bad, I am sinful. And then I need another column which says, how am I going to challenge that? How am I bad? How am I toxic? How am I sinful? Why do I still believe this when I left that setting such a long time ago? And it's a really simple thing to do with clients. And I think it's very practical, very down to earth, and it can be very, very helpful. And there's a lot more to say about it in a way, because I think sometimes one introject can lead to another, but I haven't gone into that here because there isn't the time really. But just that in itself can be very helpful, and just seeing, never mind all the complicated thinking about pseudo-identity even, it's more just like a very practical way of helping somebody to just chew over and challenge what's still stuck in their gut and they can't seem to shift it. So we need to chew over and unlayer the pseudo-identity. So I'm sort of saying, but how? So that's one little tip about how. But then if we look at it in a more sophisticated way, let's say we'll be guided by the phases. So the second part of my title was the phases of recovery and growth. So, you know, all therapy goes through various stages. John Norcross has done just loads of research on stages of change and stages of therapy, so have other people. So, you know, I'm keeping this simple because when I did my PhD research, what I kind of discovered was these phases of recovery and growth, and I found them really helpful framework for how I approach the client. And so if you think of that scenario I read out at the beginning of a client contacting you and thinking, oh gosh, you know, where am I going to go next and how do I even start this? This can be really, well, it certainly helps me. So, okay, there's some fancy thing going on here. I couldn't get rid of it. I don't even know how it got there. So there's 4 phases. So phase 1 is the need to leave physically and begin to leave psychologically. So if someone's still in the cult, they're very unlikely to be really recovering because they're still exposed to the abuse. They're still exposed to not being able to really challenge and chew over the introjects. So we need to leave physically, and the beginning to leave psychologically will start to happen then, because in order to get out, obviously we've got some processes going on. We're facing our doubts. We're thinking, what is this thing that I'm involved in? Then phase 2 is we need to leave psychologically and build an authentic identity through cognitive understanding and psychoeducation. So at this point, we're starting to unlayer the pseudo-identity as we start to understand what happened. Phase 3, we leave psychologically, or we continue the process of leaving psychologically and building an authentic identity through emotional healing. So the focus at this point is on the emotional healing. So we're addressing suppressed feelings, of which there are many in a high demand Cultic group, trauma, loss, all of, you know, all those things. I was going to say more about these. And then phase 4 is recognizing our authentic identity and our level of recovery. So one participant said, I am myself again. And I thought, oh, that's an amazing statement. And then also the issue of post-traumatic growth. So which again, I'll say a little bit more about. So who do the phases, or what I'd call post-cult counselling, which is my particular model of counselling, which I'll explain briefly in a minute. Well, survivors of coercive control, cults, other high demand situations. Catherine, mentioned, does it apply to one-on-one? Yes, I think it does. I've worked with a number of people in really toxic one-on-one relationship, coercive control. I'm not calling it a relationship. So it also applies to first, second, and multiple generation former members. But as I've said here, I hold in mind the similarities and differences. There are differences between these populations, but I hold in mind those differences and just remain alert to the nuances of each person's story. But the principle and the phases still apply, in my experience. I'm just going to unpack these a bit more. So I think I'll just have a drink before I do that. So the recovery process begins with leaving, and it is a very significant event. For pretty well everybody, it's a very big deal and very traumatic. And it entails a transition out of the world of the perpetrator or cult leader and the certainty of the narrow, rigid and restricted mindset. So you're not just losing or getting away from the abuse, but you're getting away from a sense of certainty. I know when I left, I felt like a hand grenade had gone off in terms of my spiritual beliefs and my faith. It was like, just felt all over the place. And we're also getting out of the pressured world of the thought reform or brainwashing environment. So, it's a huge culture shock, a huge adjustment. But it is a challenge entering and re-entering a world of variety, choice, uncertainty, and ambiguity. For second and multi-generation, it's just huge. For first generation, it's huge, but for second and multi-generation, it's just, so incredibly difficult. I think these poor people who are coming out of Ukraine and other, refugees and people would understand, I think, what it was like, this kind of terrible culture shock. So, see, leaving must occur both on a physical and psychological level, as I said. So if someone's to move towards recovery. So leaving physically obviously involves leaving the coercive environment. Leaving psychologically, that is in the mind and emotions, necessitates freeing this restricted identity, restoring and re-establishing genuine contact with the autonomous, authentic identity. So for second and multi-generation, that's a whole adventure they have to go on. It's a whole new big deal. So phase 2, I've just said that. So we need to understand our experience, and this occurs through psychoeducation. Now it's probably nothing new to you, but so the rationale for psychoeducation is that the therapist, without psychoeducation, the therapist may well be working with the cult pseudo-identity rather than the authentic identity, because the individual has not yet highlighted, chewed over and began to get rid of the introjected cult identity. And I suspect this is where much goes wrong in therapy. The therapist, however good, who does not see the pseudo-identity, and so the work is at cross purposes, missing the impact of the cult. So I think this happens a lot, and when I did my doctoral research, there was a lot of stuff people said about therapists, and I hear it so often, well-meaning, wonderfully trained therapists, but who are missing the cult. Second generation who've been in therapy for 6 years, and the therapist never talked about cults. And it's like, well, how is this, what is happening in that therapy? I don't understand. So it, you know, it can be working at cross purposes, and it doesn't have to necessarily be overtly saying, oh, that's your pseudo identity, but it's having that kind of idea in your mind. So how do we work with it? So if we say that the pseudo identity was layered down, so as the individual, they introject, so the pseudo identity is layered down as the individual introjects from the cult. So in some ways we kind of pull it into ourselves, and it happens through an array of different psychological processes. And each one has an explanation. Like, so much research has gone into psychology and how do things happen and whatever. And I think these things are explainable. It's not a mystery. And I think it's demystifying it perhaps. So if that's clear to you, with this idea in mind that the identity is layered on, and but there's a way of unlayering it through understanding the different psychological processes that took place for it to be layered on. And I developed this model. I'm not going into this a great deal, but I developed a model for recovery and developing an authentic identity post-cult. It's about chewing it all over. It's not about indoctrinating people. It's about giving someone an opportunity to chew over what's happened. And I've called it post-cult counselling. It kind of started out like that, which is quite a generic name, but it's stuck, and that's what I've called the model. And it's relational psychoeducation. So it's a relational and psychoeducational approach. As a therapist, I'm really committed to, or to the idea that we need to offer a relationship, and it follows the phases of recovery and growth, and it leads to understanding the dynamics, and then at a later phase, emotional healing for pain and trauma. The focus at this phase 2 is on the relational psychoeducation. So we're working at this point with phase 1 to a degree and phase 2. Phase 3 in emotional processing happens later when the individual understands what belongs to the pseudo identity and what belongs to their authentic identity. Now, it's not that black and white and clear cut. It would be great if it was. It's more messy than that. But theoretically speaking, that's what I hold in my mind. And so each of these psychological layers that layered on has a name, and so the different areas that I address in post-cult counselling, and the things that lead to understanding. Sorry, I'll read this so I don't burgle. Each of these processes or layers has a name and leads to understanding and challenging introjects, understanding trauma theory and rage. I think it's really empowering to give clients information. I'm really happy that Janina Fisher published a workbook for transforming the living legacy of trauma. She hasn't paid me to advertise this one. I think it's a really great, I love her theory. I find it really is helpful. We need to understand thought reform and brainwashing theory. It's essential. We need to understand Cialdini's theory of influence. We need to unmask the cult leaders, the people we've looked up to, we've sort of idealized and listened to and thought they knew everything, and finding like, oh, they just abused me and controlled me. We need to have assertive anger and setting our boundaries. All these are things that need reiterating and putting in place for pretty well everybody, I think. We need to understand coercive control, which is a law here in the UK, and I think other places are picking up on some of the theories around this in legal terms. And over the years, I just identified so many different areas. I mean, 32, it's quite a lot, really. So I've had to distill it down. So So the thinking behind it is the need for identifying and naming these psychological processes, which enables former members to understand more clearly the dynamics that occurred in the cult. Then they tell their story into this psychoeducational theory. So I don't have sessions where now, because I only work with former members and I only do post-cult counselling, so I never get clients coming who are still maybe in, they're always out, or they know they want to talk about cults, so it's much easier for me. But the sessions where I don't use the structure of psychoeducation, I'll explain how I use it in a second. I find it often I can feel very overwhelmed. I can come away with a lot of my nervous system really activated, and I find the individual can be quite ungrounded and like, okay, well, I just told you all these horrible things, so what are you going to do about it? And it's like, okay, well, we're going home now, we're not seeing each other for another week or whatever, 2 weeks in my case. I work fortnightly, so you know, it's kind of like, oh, well, what did I gain from that therapy? So so I'll just explain a bit more, hopefully more clearly, what post-cult counselling entails. So it applies to all types of coercive, cultic, spiritually abusive groups or relationships. I think everybody that's approached me, I've been able to use the post-cult counselling with, and if they're not right, obviously I would say. So basically, it's psychoeducation that's specially designed, and it's printed sheets in a loose leaf folder. It's nothing particularly grand at the moment. I'll tell you in a minute what I'm up to. But it's literally worksheets within a folder, and people, we go through that together. Sometimes it takes a year, sometimes they do it in a long weekend, sometimes they do it over a week, and it really shifts them. It really does. And everyone's different, and sometimes it's not right for people, but the people who can really engage with it. And I don't know if any of you know about Wellspring Retreat and Resource Centre, but it's now closed, and Paul Martin, the founder and director, died it's probably like 12 years ago now, but he's been, Wellspring and Paul Martin and his wife Barbara, really part of the building blocks of where I've got to today in my thinking about all of this and developing post-cult counselling. And I'm just saying this because I sent her my workbook, which hardly anyone's seen actually, and she said she thought it was a brilliant compilation of input of key information and cognitive paper tasks to thoughtfully aid someone through the rehabilitation process on their own or in a small group. In actual fact, my workbook isn't for people on their own, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. She said I'd done a masterful job of designing a hands-on workbook to facilitate the process, a strong addition to our field. That really deeply touched me, and I'm just telling you because it felt like a real validation from somebody who'd done this work kind of for 25 years. So what's happened is that I'm actually writing this workbook up into a book. So last kind of early autumn, I did a book proposal to Routledge and didn't think they would accept my proposal. Oh gosh. Anyway, they accepted my proposal. So I'm currently having a, thank you, Matt, I can see you. And so I've just had a writing break from clients for 3 months. It's going to have to carry on a bit longer. And it's a self-help book for former members, which has a chapter on including advice for therapists who want to use the book. And it is basically this workbook on steroids, because when I'm with the client, obviously then I'm interacting and telling them things that aren't in the workbook, but in this I'm trying to articulate you know, what hopefully will be helpful. And I've had an illustrator do the most wonderful illustrations, and I'm really excited about that aspect. So you can look out for that. It's going to be probably early next year that it comes out. Seems like a massively long process, but we'll see. That's phase 2, where we do the relational psychoeducation. We cognitively understand so that we can begin to fully psychologically lead. The emotional healing phase is building aspects of an authentic identity. So I'm not going to read that. You can see that in the handout. Max said, to me, it's pretty horrible because cult members are not feeling, but you can't even think straight unless you pay attention to your feelings. So we're healing the pain resulting from the thought reform and abuse, the brainwashing environment, from post-traumatic stress, and actually that cold reality and realization of all that the individual has been involved with. The terrible shock to think, oh my God, this wasn't actually, you know, doing God's work or something. It was something quite different. And then the shame and guilt, the humiliation, feeling a fool, all of those things. And then also within phase 4 is the reparative developmental psychotherapy. And first generation probably sometimes need to address pre-cult traumas and issues. Not always. That's a myth that every first generation joined a cult because of something in their childhood, but it's true for some. And of course, those who are born and raised, you know, will need to address developmental issues growing up in a cult. And then phase 4 is recognizing our authentic identity and recovery. So post-traumatic growth is the notion that people exposed to even the most traumatic events may perceive at least some good emerging from their struggle. And it can coexist with personal distress and growth. Those can go hand in hand. It's an accepted facet of PTSD, but I want to say it must be sensitively approached because it's not a measure of character and it's not a measure of recovery. If somebody hasn't got any sense of I've grown because of this, you know, it's not a standard. Lorna, have I got time to just read a couple of quotes?
Sure.
Thank you. So certain kinds of life experiences make people really examine who they are, you know, and this was one of them, because people either have to completely invent themselves or reinvent themselves and do so much examination to figure out who they are, who they want to be. There aren't very many life experiences that push you to do that like this does. So that's a good thing. I mean, I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but I don't regret it. I was very moved by Harriet's statement, you know. And then Fred, he says, I arrived here today having gone through the whole cleansing process. It feels like this interview is the final piece of the puzzle. I'm now free of that experience. It feels like I am myself again. It feels like my life is mine and that I am autonomous again and that I'm not beholden to anyone else's wishes. He got to phase 4. And Lindsay said, they tricked you into thinking it was them that did that to you. Love, peace, happiness, independent thought. But actually it was something inside of you that was good. This is the authentic identity. And when you realize that, you take that with you, whatever that is, that idealism, the love, the peace, the joy, whatever it is, you learn to realize that you can do that to your own mind. It's yours. Q&A now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank